She was just trying to get to work. One bus ride stood between a single black mother and the job that could save her child from hunger and eviction. But on a cold, rain-soaked afternoon, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. An elderly woman, lost, shaking and slowly slipping toward the ground while everyone else looked away. In that moment, she faced an impossible choice: protect her own future or risk everything to help a stranger who didn't look like her. What happened next wasn't just an act of kindness. It revealed how race, judgment, and power can twist the truth and punish the poor for doing the right thing. And the price she paid would shock you. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're new here, subscribe to our channel Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily new stories. Because tomorrow, we've got something extra special for you. Aaliyah Brown's life ran on tight margins and tighter routines. Every day was a careful calculation of time, money, and energy, with no room for mistakes. She woke before dawn in a small Houston apartment where the paint peeled and the walls carried every sound from the neighbors. She moved quietly so she wouldn't wake her 6-year-old son, Malik, too early, packing what little food she had, checking her phone, counting what remained in her wallet. Survival wasn't dramatic to her. It was practical. It was routine, and it was exhausting. She had not always imagined her life would look like this. Once, she had planned for stability, maybe even comfort. But plans had a way of collapsing when illness, grief, and poverty stacked themselves one on top of the other. Her mother's long fight with cancer had drained not only savings but time, strength, and hope. When her mother died, Aaliyah was left with debt, grief, and a child who depended on her for everything. There was no pause to mourn properly. Bills did not stop coming because someone was heartbroken. Most days, Aaliyah measured success in small victories. Malik arriving at school clean and fed. Rent paid just enough to buy another month. The electricity staying on one more week. These were not dreams, they were checkpoints. And when she finally landed a job at a neighborhood diner, it felt less like luck and more like a lifeline thrown at the last possible second. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it meant food, heat, and maybe a future that didn't feel like it was always about to collapse. That afternoon, the sky over Houston had already decided it would not be kind. Rain fell hard and steady, soaking streets, shoes, and patience. Aaliyah stood at the bus stop with Malik pressed close to her side, shielding him with her thin jacket as best she could. The bus was late, as it often was, and every passing minute tightened the knot in her chest. First days mattered. First impressions mattered even more when you were poor, black, and easily replaceable. She knew that being late would not be forgiven. It never was. People passed by without looking at her, without looking at Malik. That, too, was familiar. Invisibility was something Aaliyah had learned early. When you struggled long enough, you became background noise. The kind of person others noticed only when they were in the way. She had learned to keep her head down, to not draw attention, to move quickly and quietly through spaces that never felt like they truly belonged to her. The rain soaked through her shoes as she waited, watching headlights blur into long streaks of light on the wet road. Malik leaned against her, trusting, unaware of the fragile balance holding their lives together. Aaliyah told herself that all she had to do was get on that bus. Just one ride, just one shift, just one step closer to breathing again. But the city does not care about careful plans. Across the street, something caught Malik's attention. A figure sitting alone, unmoving, barely visible through the rain. Aaliyah noticed it too, though she tried not to. She had learned that noticing could be dangerous. Noticing meant responsibility, and responsibility was heavy when you already carried so much. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that she couldn't afford distractions. That kindness was a luxury reserved for people with safety nets. But even as she tried to look away, a quiet tension settled in her chest, the kind that comes when instinct clashes with fear. She had seen that look before. Confusion, fragility, the kind of vulnerability that made people uncomfortable enough to ignore it. Aaliyah stood there, caught between who she had become and who she still was underneath the exhaustion. The rain kept falling. The bus was still not in sight, and somewhere nearby, a situation was unfolding that would force her to choose between survival and compassion. She did not yet know that this ordinary afternoon, this missed bus, this moment of hesitation, would pull her into a world of judgment, power, and racial suspicion she was not prepared for. She did not know how quickly kindness could be twisted, or how dangerous it could be for someone like her to do the right thing. All she knew was that the clock was ticking, and whatever choice she made next would follow her long after the rain stopped. The moment Aaliyah stepped away from the bus stop, everything in her life began to tilt. The rain intensified, soaking her clothes within seconds, but she barely noticed. Her focus narrowed to the fragile figure on the bench across the street. The elderly woman hunched forward, shaking uncontrollably, her grip on reality slipping as visibly as her balance. Cars passed without slowing. People hurried by with their heads down, collars raised, eyes trained anywhere but on her. The city moved on, indifferent. Aaliyah's heart hammered as she reached the woman. Up close, the signs were impossible to ignore. Pale skin drained of warmth, lips tinged with blue, eyes clouded with confusion. This was not someone waiting for a ride. This was someone lost, disoriented, and in danger. Aaliyah wrapped her thin jacket around the woman's shoulders, instantly feeling the cold bite into her own skin. In that instant, behind her, the bus arrived. Doors opened, then closed. The sound cut through the rain like a verdict. By the time the bus pulled away, splashing water onto the curb, Aaliyah understood what she had just done. She had chosen a stranger over her job, compassion over survival, and there would be consequences. She guided the woman through the rain, mallet close at her side, each step heavy with uncertainty. Every passing second stretched tight with fear, fear that the woman might collapse, fear that someone would accuse her of doing something wrong, fear that this act of kindness would not be seen as kindness at all. When they finally reached the small corner store, dripping water onto the worn floor, Aaliyah felt no relief, only exposure. She was now visible in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. Inside the store, the contrast was stark. A soaked black woman, a confused elderly white woman, a small child clinging silently to his mother. It was the kind of scene that invited judgment before understanding. Aaliyah felt eyes on her, weighing her presence, measuring her intentions. She moved carefully, gently, doing everything she could to appear non-threatening, responsible, worthy of trust. This was a survival instinct she had learned long ago. As the woman slowly warmed and regained fragments of clarity, Aaliyah pieced together the truth. A son, a powerful name, a life far removed from bus stops and overdue rent. When Aaliyah finally reached the son by phone, the tension shifted, but it did not disappear. Relief came mixed with something else. Suspicion. Questions. When help arrived, it arrived wrapped in wealth and authority, and Aaliyah could feel the imbalance immediately. The son's gratitude was real, but so was his surprise. Surprise that someone like Aaliyah had intervened. Surprise that kindness had come from the margins instead of the center. As they drove through the city, leaving behind the neighborhood Aaliyah knew too well, she watched recognition flicker across his face when she gave her address. It was the look people gave when they mentally reclassified you. Poor, struggling, temporary. What began as gratitude quickly turned into offers. A meal, a ride, then something bigger, an opportunity that sounded too perfect to trust. A job caring for the elderly woman, security, stability, a lifeline that felt almost dangerous in its generosity. Aaliyah accepted cautiously, not out of hope, but out of necessity. Hope had failed her too many times before. At first, the arrangement seemed peaceful. The elderly woman calmed under Aaliyah's care. Malik was welcomed instead of tolerated. For a brief moment, it felt like Aaliyah's instincts had been right. That kindness had led somewhere safe. But beneath the surface, tension brewed. Not everyone saw Aaliyah as a caregiver. Some saw her as an intruder. Suspicion entered the home quietly, dressed in professionalism and concern. Questions about her past, about her qualifications, about her motives. The tone was polite, but the message was clear. She did not belong in this space. Her presence required justification. Every mistake she had ever made became relevant. Every hardship became evidence. The scrutiny intensified. Background checks, quiet conversations behind closed doors, looks that lingered too long. Aaliyah felt herself shrinking under the weight of being watched. She moved carefully, spoke carefully, breathed carefully. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and everything she had gained could vanish. Then the accusations came. Her past, stripped of context and compassion, was laid out as proof of unworthiness. An old arrest born from desperation. Evictions tied to illness and loss. Debt that told a story of survival, not irresponsibility. None of that mattered. In that room, her struggle was reframed as threat, her poverty as intent, her race as implication. Aaliyah stood exposed, not just as a worker, but as a stereotype waiting to be confirmed. The narrative was already written for her, a desperate black woman exploiting a vulnerable white family. It did not matter that she had saved a life. It did not matter that she had asked for nothing. The truth bent easily under the weight of prejudice. The injustice settled heavy and familiar in her chest. This was not new. This was the same story she had seen play out in different forms her entire life. Help offered, then rescinded. Trust extended, then questioned. Humanity acknowledged, then denied. As tension reached a breaking point, Aaliyah realized that the greatest danger was no longer losing a job. It was losing her dignity, losing her voice, losing control of her own story. And as powerful forces began to close in, armed with money, influence, and assumptions, Aaliyah faced a terrifying reality. Doing the right thing had brought her here. But in a world shaped by racism and unequal power, doing the right thing did not guarantee protection. It only guaranteed that the stakes were about to get even higher. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, disguising itself as concern, responsibility, and doing what's best. Aaliyah felt it in the subtle changes first. The way conversations stopped when she entered a room. The way questions were repeated, as if her first answers had not been believable enough. The way her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She noticed it in herself, too. How she began rehearsing her words before speaking. How she double-checked every small task, every cup of water, every folded blanket, terrified that a single mistake would be interpreted as proof. Proof that she was careless. Proof that she was unqualified. Proof that she never should have been trusted in the first place. Vanessa's scrutiny became constant, even when she was not physically there. Aaliyah felt it in the way Ethan hesitated before leaving the apartment, the way his eyes lingered as if weighing risk against relief. Gratitude and doubt lived side by side in him, and Aaliyah could feel the shift. She had gone from rescuer to liability without changing anything about herself. The building itself began to feel different. What once felt clean and safe now felt watchful. Cameras in the hallways, security at the front desk who looked at her longer than they looked at others, residents who smiled politely but clutched their purses tighter when Malik walked by. None of it was overt. None of it could be directly challenged. That was the cruelty of it. The racism was quiet, layered, deniable. At night, back in her small apartment, Aaliyah lay awake replaying conversations in her mind, wondering if she had said too much, or not enough, wondering if accepting the job had been a mistake. But then she would think about Malik sleeping peacefully, about Evelyn's calmer days, about food in the fridge and heat in the apartment, and she reminded herself why she stayed. Survival did not allow for pride. The accusations, when they finally surfaced fully, landed with calculated precision. Vanessa framed them as protection, as responsibility, as logic. She spoke in careful language, the kind that sounded reasonable to anyone not standing inside the storm. She questioned Aaliyah's financial stability, her living situation, her criminal record stripped of context and humanity. Each point was delivered calmly, like a list of undeniable facts. Aaliyah felt the familiar burn of shame rise in her throat, not because she was guilty, but because she was tired. Tired of defending a life built on constant recovery from loss. Tired of explaining that poverty was not a moral failure. tired of being reduced to paperwork instead of personhood. Evelyn sensed the tension even when she did not understand it. She grew more anxious on the days Vanessa visited, her confusion deepening, her hands shaking more. Aaliyah watched the woman she cared for deteriorate under stress, and it broke something inside her. The very concern Vanessa claimed to have for her mother was harming her. Still, Aaliyah stayed. She showed up early, left late, did everything by the book. She documented routines, saved receipts, took notes. She prepared herself like someone going into a battle she had never volunteered for, because she knew how these stories ended for people like her. They ended quietly, with no apology and no accountability. The breaking point did not come in a dramatic confrontation. It came in a folder placed on a table, papers neatly arranged, facts selectively chosen, a life summarized in ink and assumptions. Vanessa did not raise her voice. She did not insult Aaliyah outright. She did not have to. The power imbalance did the work for her. Aaliyah stood there, listening to her own life reframed as a warning sign, each hardship twisted into intent, each survival choice labeled irresponsibility. She realized then that no amount of kindness would ever outweigh the narrative already forming in Vanessa's mind. The story was too familiar. A black woman too close to wealth, too close to trust, too close to something she was never meant to have. Ethan was silent. That silence hurt more than the accusations, because silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant danger. Aaliyah watched the man who had once thanked her struggle between gratitude and fear, between believing his own experience and deferring to the authority of someone who looked and sounded more credible than she ever would. For the first time since that rainy afternoon, Aaliyah felt truly trapped. She could not defend herself without sounding defensive, could not walk away without confirming suspicion, could not stay without surrendering pieces of herself. Every option came with a cost. That night she barely slept. Her thoughts raced through worst-case scenarios, losing the job, losing the apartment, losing stability again. Malik overhearing whispers and absorbing the message that his mother was somehow wrong. She thought about the rain, the bus stop, the moment she had chosen to help. She wondered if the world would have punished her less for walking away. The tension reached beyond the apartment walls. It lived in phone calls that went unanswered, in meetings postponed, in decisions delayed for review. Aaliyah felt herself suspended in a space where she was neither trusted nor dismissed, just held in place under scrutiny. And beneath it all was a deeper, quieter fear, that no matter what happened next, the truth would not be enough, that the systems designed to judge worth were never built with people like her in mind, that kindness, when offered by the marginalized, was always suspect. As days passed, the air grew heavier. Something was coming, a decision, a confrontation, a reckoning. Aaliyah could feel it in the way Vanessa watched her now, not with curiosity but with certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided. And as Aaliyah stood in that beautifully furnished apartment, holding onto her dignity with both hands, she understood something devastatingly clear. The real test was no longer about whether she belonged there. It was about whether the truth would matter at all. The days that followed felt like living under a microscope. Every movement Aaliyah made seemed amplified, every choice quietly evaluated. She could feel judgment pressing down on her even in moments of calm, as if the air itself had grown heavier. The apartment, once a place of tentative hope, now felt like a courtroom where she was constantly on trial, waiting for a verdict she feared had already been decided. Vanessa's presence lingered even when she was gone. Aaliyah sensed it in the sudden requests for updates, in the insistence on schedules and documentation that had never been required before. She was asked to explain routines she had already explained, to justify decisions she had made with care and compassion. The questions were framed as concern, but their edge was unmistakable. Each one suggested doubt. Each one implied risk. Aaliyah complied with everything, knowing resistance would only confirm suspicions. She kept meticulous notes, saved every message, documented every hour. She lived in a state of constant alertness, afraid that a single oversight could be twisted into proof of incompetence or manipulation. It was exhausting in a way she struggled to describe. Not physical exhaustion, but the deep, draining fatigue of having to constantly prove one's humanity. Evelyn felt the shift more than anyone. Her anxiety spiked on days filled with tension, her confusion deepening as unfamiliar stress invaded her safe space. She clung to Aaliyah more tightly, following her from room to room, asking the same questions repeatedly. Aaliyah soothed her gently, masking her own fear so the woman would not feel it. She knew how fragile Evelyn's peace was, how easily it could be broken by conflict and suspicion. Malik noticed too. Children always did. He grew quieter in the apartment, staying close to his mother, sensing that something was wrong even if he could not name it. Aaliyah caught him watching Vanessa with wary eyes, absorbing the message that some people saw his family not as human beings, but as problems waiting to happen. That realization hurt more than anything else. The scrutiny escalated quietly but relentlessly. Phone calls were made without Aaliyah present. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Decisions were delayed under the guise of review. Each delay felt like time stretching thin, like standing on unstable ground while waiting for it to crack beneath her feet. Aaliyah began to question herself in ways she never had before. Not her actions, but her worth. She wondered if she had been naive to believe that kindness could exist without consequence, if she had crossed an invisible line by stepping into a world that was never meant to welcome her. The thought settled heavily in her chest, familiar and bitter. One afternoon, the tension finally broke through the surface. Vanessa returned unexpectedly, her expression composed but sharp, carrying the same folder Aaliyah had come to dread. The air in the room shifted instantly. Evelyn grew agitated, her hands trembling as she sensed the change. Malik froze, eyes flicking between the adults, his small body instinctively bracing for impact. Vanessa spoke calmly, outlining concerns in a measured voice that sounded reasonable to anyone not listening closely. She referenced risk, liability, reputation. Each word landed like a quiet accusation. Aaliyah stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of her, fighting the urge to shrink. She realized then that no amount of patience or proof would undo the story being told about her. The narrative was convenient, clean, and rooted in long-standing assumptions. A struggling black woman near wealth was never just helping. She must be taking advantage, must be waiting for an opportunity, must be watched. Ethan listened, torn. Aaliyah could see it in his face, the internal battle between what he had witnessed firsthand and what he was being told to fear. His silence stretched painfully, each second amplifying the power imbalance in the room. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, uncertain, framed in compromise rather than conviction. That hesitation told Aaliyah everything she needed to know. She was no longer being seen as a person. She was a risk assessment. The realization hit her hard. It wasn't just about this job or this family. It was about a system that consistently questioned the integrity of people like her, while granting unquestioned trust to those with power. It was about how easily compassion could be reinterpreted as manipulation when it came from the margins. As Vanessa closed her folder and spoke about next steps, Aaliyah felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She had felt it before, when landlords stopped returning calls, when employers found reasons not to hire her, when doors closed quietly without explanation. The slow, suffocating realization that the outcome was already decided, and she had never truly been part of the decision-making process. That night, Aaliyah walked home under a darkening sky, Malik's hand in hers. The city felt colder than usual, even without rain. She replayed the moment at the bus stop again and again, wondering if that single decision had set everything in motion, if kindness had marked her not as worthy but as vulnerable. She did not yet know what the final judgment would be, but she knew this much with certainty. The tension had reached a point of no return. Whatever happened next would expose not just her fate but the truth about who was allowed grace and who was punished for offering it. The breaking point arrived without warning, disguised as routine. Aaliyah had just finished settling Evelyn into her chair by the window, sunlight spilling across the polished floor when the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, a tightening in the air, the kind that made her chest feel too small for her breath. She sensed it before she understood it. The silence stretched longer than usual, too deliberate, too heavy. Vanessa stood nearby, composed and controlled, holding authority like a weapon that never needed to be raised. Ethan hovered close, his posture tense, caught between loyalty and fear. Papers lay neatly arranged on the table, a quiet signal that something irreversible was about to happen. This was no longer observation. This was judgment. Aaliyah felt Malik's absence sharply. He had been ushered into another room moments earlier, shielded from what was coming. That alone told her everything. Adults only. Consequences only. The kind of moment that reshaped lives without asking permission. The accusations came fast, layered, and relentless. Not shouted, not emotional, but methodical. Her past was reduced to bullet points. A life of struggle flattened into a list of risks. Each hardship was reframed as evidence. Each survival choice repackaged as intent. Context was stripped away until all that remained was a version of Aaliyah that barely resembled her at all. She felt the familiar sensation of being talked about instead of spoken to, of watching her own story slip out of her hands. No matter how steady she stood, the ground beneath her was giving way. She realized then that this was never about her performance, her care, or her integrity. It was about control, about fear dressed up as responsibility. Evelyn sensed the fracture immediately. Confusion rippled across her face, anxiety clouding her fragile calm. Her hands trembled as she looked from one figure to another, searching for safety. Aaliyah moved instinctively toward her, grounding her presence, offering reassurance without words. That small act of care, that reflexive protection, only seemed to deepen the tension in the room. The turning point came when authority shifted fully out of Aaliyah's reach. Decisions were declared as conclusions, not discussions. The tone was final, clinical. Aaliyah felt the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. She was being removed, not because she had failed, but because she had never been trusted to begin with. Her mind raced through consequences with brutal clarity. Losing the job meant losing stability. Losing stability meant risking the apartment. Risking the apartment meant risking Malik's sense of safety all over again. The chain reaction was immediate and unforgiving. She had lived this cycle before. She knew how quickly everything could unravel. But beneath the fear was something else. Anger. Quiet, controlled, but sharp. Anger at how easily compassion had been turned into suspicion, at how her race and poverty had filled in gaps where facts should have lived, at how the same system that praised kindness in theory punished it in practice when it came from someone like her. She wanted to speak, to explain, to fight, but she also knew the trap. Any emotion would be framed as instability, any defense as guilt. Silence at least preserved her dignity. So she stood there absorbing the moment, refusing to crumble. The most devastating blow came not from the accusations themselves, but from the pause that followed, the hesitation, the uncertainty etched across Ethan's face. That hesitation carried the weight of a decision that could no longer be undone. It told Aaliyah that even truth had limits when power entered the room. Evelyn's distress escalated. Her voice wavered, her confusion deepening as familiar comfort slipped away. The injustice became painfully clear in that moment. The very person they claimed to protect was the one suffering most from their actions. Yet no one stopped. No one recalculated. Aaliyah felt something fracture inside her. Not her resolve, but her belief that doing the right thing could ever be enough. She had stepped in from the rain to save a life. Now she was being quietly pushed back into the margins, reminded of her place. As the moment stretched on, Aaliyah understood that this was the climax of the story long before anyone else did. This was the moment everything converged. Racism disguised as caution, power disguised as care, kindness punished because it crossed an invisible boundary. She gathered herself, steadying her breath, anchoring herself in the thought of Malik. Whatever happened next, she would not let this moment define her worth. They could take the job. They could take the stability, but they would not take her truth. The decision landed with devastating calm. The arrangement was to be paused, reevaluated, reconsidered. Words chosen carefully to avoid responsibility but heavy enough to carry consequences. Aaliyah heard them like echoes underwater, distant, distorted, final. She moved through the apartment in a haze, collecting her belongings with deliberate care. Every step felt symbolic. Every object carried weight. She found Malik waiting, his eyes wide, searching her face for answers she was not ready to give. She took his hand, grounding herself in the warmth of his grip. As they walked toward the door, Aaliyah looked back one last time, at Evelyn, fragile and frightened, at the space that had briefly offered hope, at the people who had chosen fear over truth. She understood then that this was not just her loss. It was theirs, too. The door closed behind her with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. In that moment, standing on the other side of privilege and protection, Aaliyah felt both shattered and strangely clear. The injustice had revealed itself fully. No more guessing. No more hopping. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent as ever. Cars passed. People hurried by. Life continued. But something irreversible had happened. Aaliyah had reached the edge of everything she stood to lose. And what came next would decide whether the truth would finally be heard or buried forever. The fallout was immediate and merciless. By the time Aaliyah stepped outside with Malik, her phone was already buzzing. Missed calls, unread messages, notifications stacking on top of one another like warnings she couldn't outrun. The security desk downstairs watched her more closely now, eyes flicking from her face to the child at her side, as if confirming a narrative they had already accepted. She felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, that sharp awareness of being seen not as a mother, not as a caregiver, but as a problem exiting a building that had never truly opened its doors to her. The elevator ride felt endless. Malik's small hand tightened around hers, his silence louder than any question. Aaliyah kept her head high, even as her thoughts splintered. She calculated outcomes the way she always did: rent dates, food, transportation, school mornings. But the math no longer worked. The job was gone. The safety it provided evaporated in minutes. She could feel the ground slipping again, that terrifying sensation of starting over with less than before. When they stepped onto the sidewalk, the city hit her all at once. Noise, motion, indifference. It was the same Houston she had known her entire life, but now it felt sharper, less forgiving. She paused, steadying herself, refusing to let Malik see her break. This was not the first door slammed in her face, but it was the one that cut deepest because it came after hope. Inside the apartment they had left behind, chaos brewed. Evelyn's distress escalated into panic. Her confusion sharpened into fear as she searched for the one constant that had anchored her days. Voices rose. Instructions were issued. Professionals stepped in, efficient and detached, restoring order at the cost of comfort. The irony was brutal. In the name of protection, they had removed the only person who had truly made Evelyn feel safe. Aaliyah did not see this, but she felt it. That connection did not disappear just because a door closed. It echoed in her chest as she waited at a bus stop with Malik once again, the circle tightening cruelly around her. Rain clouds gathered overhead, a familiar threat. The city seemed to repeat itself, as if testing her resolve. Then the phone rang again. This time she answered. The voice on the other end was strained, urgent, stripped of its earlier certainty. Something had gone wrong. The situation was unraveling. The calm they expected had not returned. The systems they trusted were failing. And suddenly, the truth they had dismissed was becoming impossible to ignore. Aaliyah listened in silence, her jaw set, her pulse pounding in her ears. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions: vindication, anger, sorrow. This was not victory. This was consequence. And consequences, she knew, were rarely evenly distributed. She looked down at Malik, at the city reflected in his wide eyes, and she made a choice. Not out of desperation, not out of guilt, but out of clarity. The kind forged in moments where injustice strips everything down to what truly matters. The world had questioned her integrity, had judged her worth, had punished her for compassion. But now, faced with the reality of their own decisions, they were reaching back toward the very person they had cast aside. Aaliyah understood the weight of what came next. Whatever she decided would not just affect her family or Evelyn or Ethan. It would expose something larger, something uncomfortable, something the world preferred to ignore. As thunder rolled in the distance and the first drops of rain began to fall, Aaliyah stood at another crossroads, one defined not by fear, but by power reclaimed. This time the choice would be hers, and the consequences would be impossible to deny. Aaliyah did not respond right away. She stood there, phone pressed to her ear, rain beginning to mist the air again, as if the city itself were circling back to test her. The voice on the other end kept talking, explaining, apologizing without quite apologizing. Words like miscalculation, unexpected reaction, escalation. None of them named the real problem. None of them said we were wrong about you. She closed her eyes, memories crashing into one another. The folder on the table, the careful accusations, the way her entire life had been flattened into liabilities, the look on Malik's face when she took his hand and led him out of that building, the sound of the door closing behind her, sealing off safety as if it had only ever been temporary. Inside her chest, something hardened, not bitterness but resolve. She thought about how easily people with power could panic when systems failed them, how quickly they reached for the nearest human solution without acknowledging the damage they had caused. She thought about how often black women were asked to absorb harm quietly, then return calmly to fix what others had broken. The voice on the phone finally paused, waiting. Aaliyah asked one simple question, not angry, not emotional, clear. Was Evelyn safe? The answer came hesitantly. No, not really. She was agitated, confused, crying, asking for Aaliyah by name. That truth landed harder than any accusation had. It stripped away excuses and left only reality. The professionals were trained. The systems were approved. The safeguards were in place. And still, the one thing that mattered, human connection, had been removed. Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment press down on her. This was the fulcrum, the point where the story tipped. She could say no, walk away, protect herself and her child from further harm. No one could blame her. She had already paid enough for doing the right thing once. Walking away now would be survival, not failure. But she also knew what walking away would mean for Evelyn, for a woman already slipping between memories, whose fear had been amplified by being treated like a problem instead of a person. Aaliyah knew that kind of fear. She had seen it in her mother's eyes years ago. She had lived it. The rain grew heavier, tapping against the bus stop roof in sharp, impatient rhythms. Malik looked up at her, sensing the shift. Sensing that another big decision hovered in the air. Aaliyah met his eyes and saw trust there, complete and unwavering. Whatever choice she made, she would have to live with it in front of him. She spoke again into the phone, her voice steady but firm. If she came back, it would be on her terms. Respect. Transparency. No more decisions made about her life without her present. No more treating her past as a weapon. No more assuming guilt where there was none. The silence on the other end stretched long and uncomfortable. That silence was an answer in itself. Eventually the voice agreed, quickly, too quickly. Promises poured out, assurances layered on top of one another. The balance of power had shifted and everyone could feel it. What had been framed as charity before was now necessity. Aaliyah ended the call without another word. She did not feel triumphant. She felt heavy, because justice delayed until the powerful feel inconvenience is not justice at all. It is negotiation under pressure, and she understood that clearly now. As she stood there, rain soaking the hem of her pants, Aaliyah realized this was the true climax, not the accusations, not the folder, not the door closing behind her, but this moment right here. The moment where she saw the system clearly, stripped of politeness and pretense. It did not protect the vulnerable equally. It protected comfort, and when comfort was threatened, it scrambled. She looked at Malik again and inhaled deeply. Whatever came next, she would not disappear quietly. She would not be grateful for scraps of dignity handed back when it became convenient. She would step forward with eyes open, knowing exactly what kind of world she was navigating. As thunder cracked overhead and the rain finally poured down in earnest, Aaliyah made her decision, not just about returning, but about how she would move forward in a world that had tested her humanity and found its own reflection lacking. This was no longer just about one job, one family, or one moment of kindness. This was about whether truth, once exposed, could actually change anything at all. And as Aaliyah turned away from the bus stop, walking deliberately into the storm once more, the question lingered in the air, heavy, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. The return was not immediate. Aaliyah did not rush back as if summoned. She took Malik home first, dried his clothes, fed him, and sat with him until his breathing slowed and sleep finally claimed him. Each small act grounded her, reminding her who she was doing this for. Only then did she allow herself to sit alone in the quiet, the rain tapping against the window like a clock counting down. She replayed the call again and again. The urgency, the fear that had crept into voices once so confident, the sudden realization that control had limits when humanity was removed. For the first time since the accusations, Aaliyah felt something shift inside her, not relief, not forgiveness, but clarity. She understood now that the injustice she faced was not an accident. It was a pattern, a system that rewarded suspicion over empathy, credentials over character, power over lived truth. And when that system failed, it reached back toward the very people it had pushed aside, asking them to carry the weight without acknowledgement. When Aaliyah finally returned, the atmosphere was unmistakably different. The apartment buzzed with activity, but not the calm efficiency of before. This was frantic, disorganized. The illusion of control had fractured. Evelyn's distress was visible even before Aaliyah reached her. The woman's eyes darted, her hands trembling as if searching for something just out of reach. And then she saw Aaliyah. The change was immediate and undeniable. Evelyn's breathing slowed, her shoulders dropped, her gaze focused, anchoring itself to a familiar presence. It was not subtle, it was not debatable, it was proof unfolding in real time. Aaliyah felt the room react to it. The professionals paused, the voices softened. The tension recalibrated itself around an undeniable truth that no report or background check could erase. This was connection. This was care. This was what had been dismissed as coincidence until it could no longer be ignored. Ethan stood nearby, watching the transformation with something close to awe and regret. The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. He saw it now, not as theory or assumption, but as consequence. His earlier hesitation echoed loudly in the silence, a reminder of how easily doubt could override experience when fear entered the equation. Vanessa was there too, though quieter now. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. She watched closely, assessing not just Aaliyah's actions, but the way the room responded to her presence. This time, the evidence was not on paper. It was alive. Still, the tension did not evaporate. If anything, it sharpened, because acknowledgement brought discomfort. It demanded reckoning, and reckoning threatened the narrative that had justified everything up to this point. Aaliyah moved with deliberate calm, tending to Evelyn with the same steady care as before. She did not perform. She did not explain. She simply did what she had always done, showed up fully, without spectacle, and that quiet consistency cut deeper than any argument could have. She felt eyes on her constantly now, but the gaze had changed. It was no longer searching for faults. It was searching for answers. How had they been so wrong? How had they missed what was right in front of them? The climax of the injustice crystallized in that moment, not in shouting or confrontation, but in the slow collapse of assumptions under the weight of reality. The realization that racism did not always announce itself loudly. It often hid behind policies, procedures, and reasonable concerns, until its consequences became impossible to deny. Aaliyah understood that what was happening was bigger than her, bigger than this family, bigger than this apartment. This was about whose experiences were trusted by default and whose had to be proven again and again, even at great personal cost. As the room settled into an uneasy calm, Aaliyah felt the weight of expectation press down on her. The unspoken question lingered. Would she forgive? Would she stay? Would she continue to carry what others had mishandled? She met Ethan's eyes briefly, then Vanessa. There was no anger there now, just resolve. This was the moment when the story could no longer pretend to be about misunderstanding. It was about accountability, about whether recognition would be followed by change, or quietly buried once comfort was restored. Aaliyah knew the next decision would define everything that followed, not just for her, but for the people who had learned too late that trust is fragile, and injustice leaves scars even when it retreats. As she stood there, steady and unyielding, the truth filled the space like electricity before a storm. The question was no longer whether she belonged. The question was whether the world around her was ready to confront what it had done, and what it still refused to see. The reckoning did not come as an apology. It came as discomfort. Meetings were called, voices lowered. Words were chosen with care, not out of empathy but out of self-preservation. Aaliyah could feel it in the way people now spoke around her instead of over her, careful not to repeat what had already proven so costly. The shift was real, but it was fragile, conditional, and painfully late. Evelyn remained calm only as long as Aaliyah stayed close. The moment distance crept in, confusion returned, sharp and disorienting. The professionals took notes, observed, whispered. They labeled it situational dependency, as if numbing it could neutralize what it revealed. But everyone in the room understood the truth they were trying to outrun. Care could not be standardized. Trust could not be outsourced. And humanity did not respond to credentials alone. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice controlled but tight. She acknowledged the change without naming its cause. She referenced outcomes without addressing actions. It was a performance of responsibility that avoided the one thing that mattered most: accountability. Aaliyah listened without interruption, recognizing the familiar pattern. When systems failed, they corrected quietly, never publicly, never personally. Ethan tried to bridge the gap. His words circled the truth, careful not to crash into it. Gratitude softened with regret, regret diluted by fear. He spoke of moving forward, of stability, of what was best for everyone. Aaliyah heard the unspoken addendum: if things could just go back to being comfortable. But comfort had already been exposed as the problem. Aaliyah realized then that the climax was not a single moment. It was a collision, between who held power and who bore consequences, between whose fear mattered and whose was dismissed, between a system that demanded proof from the vulnerable and trust from the privileged. She stood there steady, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and understood something with painful clarity. Even now, even after everything, the burden of repair was being placed on her shoulders. To soothe, to stay, to make it work, to absorb the damage quietly so others could feel absolved. That was the final injustice. Aaliyah spoke, not defensively, not emotionally, but with a calm that cut through the room. She named boundaries. She named respect. She named the harm that had been done without asking for permission to name it. The air shifted again, sharper this time, because truth, when spoken plainly, leaves no room to hide. No one interrupted her. When she finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, of discomfort, of consequences finally taking shape. This was the moment where the story could no longer be softened or reframed. Aaliyah had not just survived the injustice. She had forced it into the light. And as she stood there, unwavering, one truth rang louder than anything else. What happened next would reveal whether this reckoning meant change, or whether the world would retreat back into silence once again. The days after the reckoning did not unfold with celebration or triumph. There was no neat ending, no dramatic justice served in a single moment. Instead, there was something quieter, heavier, and far more real. Life continued, but not unchanged. Aaliyah stayed. Not because she felt she owed anyone forgiveness, and not because the system had suddenly proven itself worthy of her trust. She stayed because Evelyn needed stability, because Malik needed consistency, and because walking away now would have meant surrendering the ground she had finally forced into view. But staying did not mean forgetting. It did not mean excusing, and it certainly did not mean returning to silence. Clear boundaries were set, not as requests but as conditions. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors now included her. Decisions about her work, her presence, her life were no longer made without her voice. The tone shifted, not out of moral awakening, but out of recognition that something fragile had been broken and could not be ignored again. Ethan changed first. Not overnight and not perfectly, but noticeably. He listened more than he spoke. He asked instead of assumed. He began to understand that gratitude without accountability was hollow, and that his hesitation during the crisis had carried consequences far beyond that moment. He apologized, not with polished language or legal caution, but with uncomfortable honesty. It did not erase the harm, but it acknowledged it. And for the first time, Aaliyah felt seen not as a solution to a problem, but as a person who had been wronged. Vanessa changed differently. Her transformation was slower, more restrained, shaped less by empathy and more by exposure. She could no longer deny what had happened. The evidence had unfolded in real time, undeniable and public. She did not offer warmth. She did not offer friendship, but she offered space. And in a system built on control, space itself was a concession. Evelyn, in contrast, blossomed. With the tension lifted, her days grew calmer. Her confusion softened when she was met with patience instead of pressure. She laughed more. She slept better. She spoke Aaliyah's name often, anchoring herself in that familiarity. Malik became a constant joy in her life, a reminder of innocence and continuity. In caring for Evelyn, Aaliyah saw echoes of her own mother, and with them, a quiet healing she had not expected. But healing did not erase memory. At night, after Malik was asleep, Aaliyah often sat alone and replayed the journey that had brought her here. The rain-soaked bus stop, the missed opportunity, the accusations delivered with professional calm, the folder of her life reduced to liabilities, the door closing behind her, the phone call that followed when the system failed without her. She understood now that the most dangerous part of racism was not always cruelty. It was credibility. Who was believed without proof? Who was doubted no matter how much proof they offered? Who was granted grace and who had to earn it endlessly? Her story was not rare. It was painfully common. Millions lived versions of it every day, quietly, invisibly, without cameras or witnesses. Black women whose kindness was questioned. Black mothers whose desperation was criminalized. Black caregivers whose humanity was acknowledged only when absence exposed its value. Aaliyah began to speak, not loudly, not performatively, but deliberately. When asked about her work, she told the truth. When new professionals entered the space, she explained her role without shrinking it. When conversations about risk surfaced, she named the fear beneath them. She did not educate gently for comfort. She educated honestly for change. And something unexpected happened. Others listened. Not everyone, Not always, but enough. Small shifts followed, policies adjusted, language reconsidered, assumptions challenged, nothing revolutionary on paper, but meaningful in practice. Aaliyah understood that progress rarely arrived as a wave. It came as pressure applied steadily by those who refused to disappear quietly. For Malik, the impact was profound. He watched his mother navigate injustice without losing herself. He saw her stand firm without becoming cruel. He learned that dignity did not mean silence and that survival did not require surrender. The world would try to define him before he ever spoke, but he would grow up knowing that his voice mattered. Aaliyah knew the scars would remain. She would never forget how quickly trust had been revoked, how easily her life had been reframed as threat, how conditional safety had revealed itself to be. That knowledge lived inside her now, not as bitterness, but as armor. And yet she did not regret her choice. Not the choice at the bus stop. Not the choice to return. Not the choice to speak. Because kindness, even when punished, had still mattered. It had saved a life. It had exposed a truth. It had forced a reckoning that would ripple far beyond one family. This story did not end with justice fully served. It ended with awareness sharpened, power slightly redistributed, and silence broken. And that, too, was impact. As viewers, it is easy to see moments like this as isolated incidents, as unfortunate misunderstandings, as rare exceptions. But they are not. They are reflections of a system that measures worth unevenly and punishes compassion when it comes from the margins. The question this story leaves behind is not whether Aaliyah did the right thing. She did. The real question is this: how many acts of kindness are quietly punished every day because of race, class, or power? And how many truths go unheard because no one was willing to stand where Aaliyah stood? If this story moved you, sit with it, talk about it, share it. Challenge the assumptions you see, especially the ones that feel reasonable. Because racism does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sounds like concern. Sometimes it looks like policy. And sometimes it only reveals itself when kindness refuses to stay invisible. The choice now is ours.